Good morning, everyone. I see our students from our Student Managed Investment Fund here in the front row about to learn a lot. I'm Madeline Pumariega. I'm the president of Miami Dade College. I'd like to welcome everyone from Brookings, everyone from our college and campus communities. I think this is an important conversation for our students and our faculty and staff to engage in. Certainly what's at stake in 2024, the federal debt and government spending is so important. Just thinking about something that has an impact on all of our students, and that's the Pell Grant. And when we think about the federal Pell Grant, it has a $6 billion shortfall in the years to come. How do we make sure that we make the right policy decisions so that we can safeguard the Pell Grant and ensure it's the pathway for so many to achieve the American dream? Right here at Miami Dade College, nearly 60% of our students are first in their families to attend college, and almost 70% rely on some type of federal financial aid. And so this has a direct impact on education when we think what's at stake. We know that education is still the driver of economic mobility in our, not only in our community, but we see it across the country. And so making sure that we continue to see those investments in education is so critically important to drive a talented workforce for each of our communities, but most importantly, build a path to economic prosperity. That really can't be done unless the country has prosperity of its own to ensure that we again fund the programs that are important. So I think today's conversation among leading economists in the country, I think, is so vitally important to be informed. We know that being informed provides the opportunity for you to engage and to make a difference and to have your voice heard. So we are incredibly proud to be a convener of this type of forum. And without further ado, I really want to introduce and bring to the podium Cecilia Rouse, the president of the Brookings Institute. Please join me and welcome to Miami Dade College and welcome to Miami.
Well, good morning. I want to thank all of you who are here in person, and hello to all of those of you who are watching online. So, as your president just mentioned, we are here because we believe this is a really important issue. I was just looking at my Bloomberg clips, and apparently the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank are convening international leaders this week. And on day 2, maybe this actually happened on day 1, they were rather critical of the US for not addressing our ballooning debt. So today's conversation, the issue we're focused on today, is center both for us, for all of you. I think our panelists will be discussing how this is really an issue for all of you, and we want to make sure you have choices in your future, but it's something that the rest of the world is watching as well. So my job is to set the scene and to make sure that we're all on the same page, understanding what all these economic terms are and how we got here. And then I will be happy to introduce our panelists who will then outline and discuss some of the options for addressing today's federal debt, at least as they see them. So in addition to being the president of Brookings, I'm also a professor of economics at Princeton, so we're gonna go to school. So first of all, I'd just like to define what we mean by deficit. So we have the deficit's composed of 2 parts. There is what the government is spending, and then I'm going to get to what the government is taking in. So as you can see in this chart, government spending has been increasing over the past several decades. Between 1970, okay, let's see, one question I have is, oh yes, here we go. You can see between 1970 and 1980 or so, it was increasing somewhat. It has really taken off since about 2000, and in particular, you can see that there are bumps up. This was the global financial crisis of 2008. You see it ticked up a lot. This is the pandemic, when we had the federal government stepping in order to help us get through that health crisis. Most economists would agree that in times of crisis, such as during the global financial crisis, where we had just the economy really stalled, we didn't have a lot of demand for workers, and we went into recession, that's an appropriate time for the federal government to step in and to do what we call deficit spending, spending more than we're taking in revenues. Whoops, I got ahead of myself. And it was appropriate to do so now. See, it went fast going forward. So it was appropriate to step in during the global financial crisis. It was particularly important to step in during the pandemic, when we really just powered down our economy. But what you see here is spending has been increasing even during times when we're not in crisis. Okay, so that's one half of the ledger. And I should note that part of the reason why economists think it's appropriate to step in when we have to power down the economy is we think in the long run, though, that we know we have to balance the budget. We have to be thinking of we bring in revenues to balance the spending. If I add revenues on top of here, however, you can see that we have not been so good at doing so. In fact, while revenues, while revenues were keeping a pace up until about 2000, since then we've had a couple of tax cuts, which I will describe later, and that revenues have fallen far short of spending over this time. So the revenues is the money that the federal government takes in. So yesterday was tax day, so I hope you all got in your federal income taxes. So federal revenues are composed of income taxes. It's also composed of tariffs, corporate taxes, the taxes you pay for Social Security and for Medicare. And so you can see that since about 2000, revenues just have not been keeping up with the level of spending. And just to belabor the point, the difference between the two is the annual deficit. So the deficit is literally the difference between what we're spending and what we're taking in terms of revenues. You can see that between 1998 and 2001, we actually had a surplus. This is at the end of the Clinton administration. And so in those years, the federal government was actually taking in more revenue than it was spending. But that was an anomaly, at least over the last 50 years. Okay, so now the question becomes, so how does the deficit become the debt? So when we deficit spend, just like, I'm going to try to avoid the analogy of the household, because households have budget constraints, right? You only take in so much money. The federal government does not. We'll get to that at the very end with the debt limit, but that's not really a constraint. But when the federal government spends more, it takes in revenues, it has to borrow in order to pay the difference. And when we borrow, that's what it does so by issuing government bonds, and bonds are essentially promises to pay back that money in the future. So the promise is to pay that back plus interest. So if we were to, for those of you who take calculus, if you were to take the integral, I'm not going to really torture you with that. But if you were to add up all of the deficits over the many years and add in the interest that the government owes, you're going to get the federal debt. And what you see here is the level of federal debt over time. And you can see that that has increased quite substantially, especially since 2000. And so that it was only about, you can see that it was, quite low in 1970, and today it's risen to about $27 trillion. Now, $27 trillion sounds like quite a bit, but we have to keep in mind that our economy has also been growing over this time, and so that we're capable of spending more money. So economists often will refer to the jet to GDP ratio. The GDP represents the size of our economy, and so this is a way of normalizing it. That could be good news if it were going to rescue us here. Unfortunately, it's not, because even if we consider the growth in the size of the economy, we can still see that our debt has gotten quite large. Whereas it used to be in 1970 less than 30%, the debt to GDP ratio was less than 30%. Today we're closer to 85%. That puts us, ahead of some of our peer countries in the OECD, for example. Germany's debt to GDP ratio is 49%. Australia's is 34%, Canada's at 31%. So, we like to be the leader in many things, perhaps not debt to GDP. On the other hand, Japan has been running a debt to GDP ratio of over 100% for many years, and their economy continues along as well, which is why I think it's why it's been easy for politicians to not actually, our policymakers to not actually make decisions here, but our panelists will talk more about that as we go forward. Okay, so I mentioned that we economists think that it's appropriate to deficit spend in times of crisis, and you can see that. This is, again, going back to our percent of GDP, so it's debt to GDP. You can see during World War II, we had a debt to GDP ratio that was above 100%. This is one of the highest we've had, at least over the past century. And that was during World War II. The federal government needed to spend on military operations, equipment, and it needed to keep our economy going at home. However, you can see that after the war, the economy normalized, the federal government got its spending under control, and the debt to GDP ratio gradually fell over the ensuing decades. However, since 1980, we've seen there's been an increase, and especially since the 2008 financial crisis, we've seen a big run-up in our debt to GDP ratio, exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis. So, again, it was appropriate to do here during the financial crisis because we had an economy that was where we had the crisis in our housing sector and our financial sector. During the pandemic, I would argue what the federal government was spending on was healthcare, which was really important during a health emergency. People could not work, so we had extended UI benefits. Normally, unemployment insurance benefits are paid by states, but during the periods of crisis, the federal government steps in. They increase the size of the unemployment insurance benefits and have them go for longer. And as you know, many people needed to still pay their rent, buy food, et cetera, so the federal government sent checks. So all of that spending was during the crisis. The challenge is, as we get past the crisis, it is now incumbent upon our policymakers to address the spending, make spending and tax revenue choices so that as after World War II, we can start to normalize that, normalize our debt to GDP ratio. Okay, so what are the choices? So first, let's think about the spending. So federal spending is divided into two types. First, we have discretionary spending. This is the kind of spending that is up to the federal government every year. That's why it's called discretionary. So it includes many key functions of government. You can see that spending on defense is 47% of discretionary spending. If you add in veterans benefits, which is really what we owe our prior military, you have that military expenses, defense, is over 50% of discretionary spending. Other categories include transportation. Some of Pell Grants is here. Some of the Pell Grant spending is actually under mandatory, but some of our educational expenses are here, transportation expenses are here. This is the part of the spending debate that happens in Washington where there are choices that our policymakers have to make every year. And so this becomes the target when there's a threat of a government shutdown, when they can't agree on the budget, when they can't agree on what levels of spending and what to spend money on. They're talking about discretionary spending, and it's these categories that are at question when we face a government shutdown. The other half of the spending is what we call mandatory. So mandatory spending is, we made a decision at some point, our policymakers made a decision. We're gonna promise to pay, for example, Social Security or Medicare, which is health insurance for our older Americans. We are promising that we are going to make these payments for these people, and so we're not going to have a discussion about it every year. You could say they're on autopilot. They are allocated by a formula, and so they're called mandatory spending. Some people call them entitlements. This is what you see where we have Social Security is about 27% of our mandatory spending. Medicare and Medicaid, so health insurance for our older Americans and our disadvantaged Americans in Medicaid is 33%. And all other mandatory spending, which includes a portion of Pell Grants, it's got some transportation, some military and housing, is about 40%. So this is not up for debate every year. These are programs which Congress could go in and change the laws, but they have to change the fundamental law. They cannot be debating the levels of the spending each year. An interesting fact is that back in 50 years ago, in 1969, 2/3 of the spending by the federal government was in the discretionary category. Now, some of this was because of military. This was during the Cold War when we were spending a lot on defense, especially compared to the size of our economy. But you can see that discretionary spending was 2/3 of our budget. Today, that has flipped. Now, the mandatory spending is taking up about 2/3 of our budget. So this means that when we get to those choices about whether we're going to be in deficit spending or not, and when our policymakers are making decisions each year about a shutdown or not, they really have to focus on discretionary, and you can see that they do not have, most of the budget is not in question. That only about the discretionary part of the budget is just 30% of the budget, and that's what they're fighting over. And so that's going to be hard for them to actually balance the budget just on the backs of the discretionary. They've got to be dealing with mandatory. So the question is, what happened? How did it get to be that our mandatory spending got to be the biggest share of our budget? So you're going to hear from Ben Harris, my colleague at the Brookings Institution, in a moment, but he's done some analysis where you can see that a lot of the drivers for the increase in mandatory spending is due to the aging of our population and our spending on retirement. So if you look at the graph on the left, you see the share of our US population that's 65 and older as a share of our population. This line here is today. You can see that back in 1983, those older than 65 were about 12% of the population. And that is, so today we're at closer to what, 18%? But that, if we just project out to 2053, we have that those 65 and older will be about 20% of the population, so almost doubling over that time. This is largely the aging of the baby boom. So we had a big cohort of babies that were born after the war, and just as we all do, they age every day. And as they're getting older, they are, our population is getting older, is aging along with them. And so what does that mean? Well, they're retiring. And so if you look at the dark blue, this is what Ben has calculated. If you look at the dark blue part of this graph, again, this is today, so this is a projection, you can see that the dark blue part, which is the share of our mandatory spending that's going to retirement, so this is Social Security, this is Medicare, is just becoming much larger share of our GDP, and that is the portion that is increasing the fastest. So, what are we going to do about that? So if we want to keep spending like this on our older population, and this is where some of the fierce debate comes from, politicians and our policymakers have a hard time saying to older workers and those who've been working a long life, we are going to cut your Social Security, we're going to cut your health insurance just at a time when maybe you need more health insurance. So these are hard decisions. Our panelists will discuss some of this. But we do have an option, right? We could increase revenue. So how are we doing on the revenue side? We already know we're not doing so well, but what is that really looking like? So this graph shows you the ratio of revenue to spending over time. I put in this line here at 1, which tells you the point at which revenues equal spending. That would be that we have a balanced budget. So you can see this is, again, this period between 1998 and 2001 when we were in surplus, so we had more revenues than we were spending. But in general, we've been below 1. This is just really a reformulation of the same point that we've been spending more than we've been taking in revenues. But I want to highlight a couple of points here. One is to point out that we start to lose revenue to spending in years following tax cuts. So here we have tax cuts that happened in 1981. We had some tax increases in 1993, so we saw revenue rise. We had the tax cuts in 2001, 2003. We saw a decrease in the ratio. And then most recently, we have the tax cuts from 2017, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, and there's been a decrease as well. There's been an uptick because as we were getting through the pandemic, but you can see that it's starting to fall once again. So the question is, so how much did tax cuts contribute to our overall debt? So the Congressional Budget Office, which is nonpartisan, and which one of our panelists used to head in the early 2000s, has done some projections. That doesn't mean he's going to stand by these projections, by the way. But the Congressional Budget Office has done some projections, and so we did some analysis on them. And if you start in 2000, where we basically did not have a big debt, we basically had a balanced budget in 2000, you can see that the dark orange is the contribution of the tax cuts from 2001, 2003. The lighter orange is the tax cuts from 2017. Fundamentally, you can see that tax cuts have contributed basically more than 50% to our debt over the past 20 years. Now, this is not a partisan issue. Yes, the 2001-2003 tax cuts were associated with the Republican president, as was the 2017 tax cuts. But President Obama extended some of the tax cuts in 2001 and 2003 as well. So this is not a partisan issue. It's just very hard for our policymakers to increase taxes, even when we know that we need the revenue. And this means that compared to our peers, we pay relatively less in taxes than our peers. So in the United States, we have the ratio, tax revenue as a proportion of GDP in the United States is about 28%. That compares to 35% in the UK, 39% in Germany, and even Japan, which is rather fiscally conservative, is paying 34%. So this is just by way of saying, you know, it's a choice as to how much we're going to pay in tax revenues, but compared to our peers, we pay relatively less. So a question you might have, and a fight that we seem to be facing more often, is, well, does the debt ceiling constrain the debt? And the basic answer is no. And the reason is because the federal government doesn't literally face a budget constraint. We don't literally, there's nothing that literally says, except for this debt ceiling, that says we can't borrow more money. There's not a credit card company that's saying you've hit your limit and we're not extending any more credit. There's not a bank making a decision. We might hear that there are financial markets that say, no, we've had enough. We won't buy any more federal bonds, government bonds. But there's not the same constraint there. The debt ceiling, the debt limit, in theory could mean, well, you've hit your debt limit. The federal government can't borrow anymore. If the federal government hits that debt limit, it means we stop paying the interest on bonds, and we therefore go into default, which would be economically actually pretty catastrophic in the United States. The reason it doesn't constrain our debt is because it's a political decision, and so Congress can just increase the debt limit or suspend the debt limit. And you can see that's precisely what it has done. And it has done so when there are Republicans in the White House. It has done so when there are Democrats in the White House. And in fact, in this chart, which ends in about 2015, the debt ceiling has been raised or suspended 8 more times since then. So while it theoretically provides a constraint on our debt, because politically it can be altered and suspended, it does not. We are I think we're one of 2 countries in the world that has a debt limit. One of the challenges with it is it's really an obligation to pay. The debt is an obligation to pay on spending choices we've already made. And so really the place where we need to make decisions and be constrained and disciplined about our debt is at the choice of where we're deciding what to spend and how much revenue to take in, which brings us to our panel today. We have 3 choices in this country, big choices. We can keep the debt rising, that we can just keep letting it increasing. We can raise taxes, increase our revenue. We can cut spending, including doing some reform of our entitlement programs. Our panelists today are going to help us think through some of those decisions. So I'd like to introduce, I'm going to invite them to the stage, and I'd like to introduce, actually maybe I should have them come first, and then I'll introduce, okay, yes, I'm getting nodded. Please join me on the stage. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, to my immediate left is Betty Nguyen, who's our moderator. She's a morning news co-anchor for CBS Miami, so many of you may recognize her. We also have with us Doug Holdsaken, who's the president of the American Action Forum. We also have Oliver Gilbert, who's the chairman of the Miami-Dade County Board of Commissioners in District 1. And last but not least, we have Ben Harris, who's the vice president and director of economic studies at the Brookings Institution. Thank you all for joining us today.
Well, good morning. Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here today. Hopefully you can hear me well. Yeah, debt, isn't it fun? And we are going to tackle every problem with answers and solutions, right?
Sure.
Well, we're going to try. It's a big question. As we saw, there are a lot of variables, a lot of possibilities. So let's just dive right into it. I want to start with the talk about debt. It seems enormous, right? And a lot of people talk about the consequences of it, but yet we haven't seen any major catastrophic ones as of yet. So in some sense, are we getting it wrong about all of the fear surrounding it? I want to start with you, Ben.
So, great question. Okay, I'm 46 years old. There's a decent chance that in my lifetime, this will not become a huge issue. There's also a decent chance that in the next 2 or 3 years, it will blow up our whole economy. So like that source of uncertainty is really unsettling, at least for me. I'm getting increasingly concerned about the debt. And President Rouse alluded to this because it is not a natural law that says the debt at some point gets too big where it's a problem. So when does the debt become a problem? The debt becomes a problem when financial markets say that the debt is a problem. And just like we saw in 2008, where financial markets eventually said, look, all this borrowing to finance this massive housing expansion in the United States has become a problem, and we had a very deep recession, the deepest recession of my lifetime. This could happen again, where financial markets say, look, we are effectively playing the referee because these are the ones who are buying the debt in the first place. And there may become a point where they say, look, this is too much. And you're starting to see these cracks already. You're starting to see downgrades by the credit rating agencies. You're starting to see interest rates rise. And you're starting to see these little signs where the buyers of the debt, that's why I say financial markets. So these are like pension funds, these are foreign central banks. This is everyone in this room who has a 401k. You probably own some treasuries in your 401k. So it's investors in general. And at some point, investors will say, look, we're worried about this. This is a problem. And then that becomes a problem for everyone else because interest rates rise. It becomes more expensive to buy a house. It becomes more expensive to make the payments on your credit card. It becomes more expensive to borrow if you want to start a small business. And then you can see all these other challenges with financial stability, and anyone who was alive in 2008 knows how problematic that is. So that's really why I'm worried about the debt right now.
So let me ask you, Doug, when it comes to this, should it be balanced with higher spending, lower taxes? Because things can fluctuate, right?
Yeah, well, first of all, Ben is a raving optimist, so just note for the record. I am 66, and there are two versions of the problem. One is the financial market explosion that Ben described. The other version is the one I think we're living through. In the 20th century, from 1960 to 2000, the US economy grew fast enough that the standard of living doubled roughly every 29 years. Since then, in the 21st century, the standard of living doubles at a pace that's roughly every 56 years. And so access to the American dream has gone from one working career to fading, going over the horizon. And people feel that. There's a palpable sense of not having the same opportunities that we had before. I believe a lot of that is the headwinds provided by debt. To grow, you have to save and invest as a nation, and the debt subtracts from that saving and investment, and it does a little bit every year. Now, we don't notice any 1 years, and we don't have the financial market explosion every year, but cumulatively, this has cost the US economy, in my calculations, about $19,000 per person. I'd like my 19, I don't know about you. That's what we're paying for. And so we do have to find a way to address this. I don't know anyone who thinks the solution's just raising taxes. I don't know anyone who thinks the solution's just cutting spending. I think that both are going to have to play a role in getting us back to something that's a more sustainable fiscal future. And the more important question than how much is how will we raise taxes? How effectively can we raise them without interfering with the economy? And how can we have a social safety net that meets the needs of our seniors and our less affluent Americans and still is manageable and sustainable? And I think that's the challenge. And to give you a flavor of it, think about Social Security. Social Security is the best anti-poverty program the United States has ever had. It has rescued so many seniors from dire straits. But right now, the Social Security system is not financially sustainable for more than about 10 years. And that means someone who is 55 and trying to plan their retirement has no idea what Social Security they will receive. That's a terrible way to run a pension system. So we need to have a smart discussion about what we need from our social safety net because it's an important part of the fabric of people's lives and put it on a track that's going to be sustainable. That's the main challenge.
I just want to follow up on that because when you talk about Social Security, we've heard for so many years that it's not going to be solvent, it's not going to be there by the time you get there and you need it. So how can you continue to ask people to pay into something that you will not reap the benefits of?
So there's no question that Congress is going to act to extend the solvency of the Social Security system. And the question is how they're going to act, how much are they going to do in taxes, how much are they going to do in spending. And my point is the sooner they act, the more we're all going to know exactly what the deal is and we'll be able to plan our lives effectively. That's the challenge. But you do have in younger workers a real lack of confidence that they're ever going to see Social Security, and that's not okay. We should fix that. We should fix it now.
Yeah, we're going to dive into that just a little more, a little bit later, but I want to get to Chairman Gilbert to talk about this at the local level because a lot of you, we're feeling it, right? And we want to know how this affects us locally. So when we talk about this massive debt, Chairman, it seems big, it seems national, but at the local level, it does trickle down, correct? Explain how that works.
Well, first let me say thank you for having me. And you're 45, 46, and you're 66. I'm 51. So if we're all just telling our age, I'm 51.
In the middle.
I'm like right here in the middle. I don't understand.
On a panel with children.
So he's like a raging optimist, and he is the gloom and doom. I'm the contemporaneous now, and so it's interesting because locally, I don't know that we see it that way. So it's interesting when I think about how it affects local communities and people. It's probably at that point when they can't pay their credit card bill because the interest rate goes up, or they can't get the loan to buy the house. But up until that point, it's only as big as we make the conversation for them. And what I don't like about the conversation about debt and deficit and debt ceiling is that we politicize it so. We politicize it so it becomes something that we talk about in terms of getting elected and political parties, when in truth we need to be talking about it in terms of first decide what it is we want to do as a country. What services do we want to provide? At what level do we want to provide them? Then once we decide that, talk about where we're going to get the money to pay for it. But first you decide what you want to do, and you see that on a local basis all the time. I used to be mayor of Miami Gardens, and even now in the county commission, when we have our budget workshops, we know we have this much money to work with. The first question we ask, we open it up to the public and say, hey, what do you want? Do you want more parks? Do you want more police officers? Do you want more firefighters? This is what it costs. If it costs me an average of $100,000 to fund a police officer, then you're telling me you want more police officers. What I'm telling you is we have to get this $100,000 from somewhere. But the first thing is deciding what you want. We don't ever have that conversation as a country, not during elections, not during academic settings, not really on panels. We don't have that national conversation about what it is we actually want to do. Because we had that conversation, what we find is no one's going to actually, you're right, they're going to save Social Security because we're not going to let our seniors who've worked their entire lives, retire and not have dignity. We're going to address Social Security. We're never going to take medical care away from seniors or people who really can't afford it, because first, it's a lot more expensive to treat people in an emergency room. So we know we want folks going to the doctor on a regular basis, having access. How are we going to pay for it then? And so how are we going to pay for it, and what are we going to cut in other areas? If we started there, what we want and what we want to provide, and then we evolve that conversation to how we pay for it, I think that we probably could come up with something that would not be perfect. There's not a perfect solution, but there's a balance to be had and to be found. We just have to be adults about it and have the conversation. And I'm 51 years old.
Well, it makes sense, right? Being fiscally responsible, but the reality of the situation is we're in an election year. Is fiscal responsibility electable? Is that going to get the person in the office, right? And I know, Doug, you just recently had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal talking about former President Trump's tax cuts, which end in 2025. Explain how this is going to affect all of us.
So the 2017 tax law had provisions, lower tax rates, bigger standard deductions, particular write-offs for small businesses and large businesses, all of which go away at the end of 2025. They were not written into permanent law, but they were temporary. So if nothing happens, if you just put the world on autopilot, that's a $3.3 trillion tax increase over the next 10 years. It would affect every American. The president has pledged not to tax anyone making under $400,000. Mr. Trump pledges something every day, but I don't think he's in the business of raising taxes. So something has to happen for both of the leading candidates to fulfill their campaign promises. My point is simply, what should happen? It shouldn't be, let's do 2017 all over again or nothing. Let's think about what our country needs in 2025. What is the tax code that will raise the revenue necessary and allow the economy to grow at an adequate pace? And that's what we should do. It should be a 2025 decision, not something governed by the history.
Okay, well, I'm going to toss it over to the optimist over here. And Ben, what do you think about that?
No, I mean, I agree with Doug. I mean, I think that to a certain extent, I mean, it's easy to like blame politicians, but we keep electing politicians who keep backing policies that increase the debt time over time. I mean, to a certain extent, it's our fault. And we've never demanded fiscal responsibility out of politicians in a way, at least was like a credible threat to vote them out of office. We've demanded low taxes, we've demanded lots of services, we've demanded relief during economic downturns, but we haven't really demanded fiscal responsibility, and that may change, and I think that it's going to take not just a change from policymakers, but also from the American public in order to get to where we need to get to. Hey, let me just sort of go back. I also really just want to agree with something that Doug said earlier when he talked about Social Security and Medicare, because I think it's really important to get the facts straight. And so when I was Assistant Secretary of Treasury, it was my job to oversee the working group for the trust funds for Social Security and Medicare. 2031, as Doug said, roughly within 10 years, Medicare is projected to, the Medicare Trust Fund is projected to go bankrupt, at which point Medicare can make payments about $9 out of every $10 it owes. So that isn't to say Medicare will just go away, but Medicare cannot make all the promised payments unless Congress decides to go ahead and just fund it anyway. Social Security is currently projected to go bankrupt in 2033, at which point it can only make payments about 3 out of every $4 that's promised. But I think it's something that Doug said I really agree with, which is it is very problematic to wait until 2031 or 2033 to solve the problem. Right. These are long-term problems that demand solutions in advance. We're still seeing the effects today and changes in Social Security to a reform that was made in 1983. These are decade-long solutions, and waiting until the very last end is wildly irresponsible. So I think that this is, I mean, you can maybe look at those projections and say, oh, great, we've got 9 years to figure it out. But if we wait 9 years, it's going to be a much harder problem to solve.
Which has me thinking, you know, we talk about government spending, right? And we're always seems at the door of a government shutdown until we pass something that both can agree on, right? So both parts. So when it comes to Social Security, are we going to be dealing with that? Does that look like it's a projection here that we're going to get on the doorstep of, no, they can't make their payments, and then everyone's going to be panicking, Congress is, to pass something that makes sense, and at that point, can they do the math in time? Can they figure this out? Do they have enough time to make those decisions on the fly at the very last minute?
Look, this is all politics. And the expertise exists to fix it today, tomorrow, or God forbid, we wait till 2033 and we see the Senate in their pajamas. That's a terrible way to do this. So it is important that they act soon so that people can know the benefits they'll receive. I think it's also important for everyone to understand that the word cut gets tossed around in these conversations far too much. Right now, Social Security is going to grow on average at 5.5% a year for the next 10 years. And revenue will grow at roughly the pace of the economy. So if we have a 2% growth in the economy and 2% inflation, it's going to grow at about 4%. And that's the fundamental problem. Like, the revenue sources don't grow as fast as the spending. We don't need to cut spending, we need to slow the growth somewhat. And that just means being, you know, in many ways, just being a little more parsimonious with people who have been affluent their entire lives and will get less Social Security than they were previously promised, but they'll still get Social Security. No one's gonna see a cut. You might not get what you were promised, but you're gonna get more than if we do nothing. And that's the important thing.
But when it does come to some of these pullbacks, if you will, right, we're not going to call them a cut because I know you don't like to call them cuts, but if we do see that on the national level, that's going to trickle down, Chairman, to the local level and help us understand what that means for specific programs that affect people here in the audience, folks that live here in Miami-Dade.
Before we get to that, let's. When I say we need to have a comprehensive conversation, Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, those are very interesting things to me, because Social Security specifically, we probably should have a conversation with regard to, and I'm not an economist, but as I see it, we don't have enough people paying in for the people who are actually collecting now, because the baby boomers got older, they're in the system, and we have a declining birth rate, and we're cutting back on immigration at the same time. And so sometimes we don't actually connect those conversations, but at some point, we're going to have to realize that the system requires more people paying into it, or the people paying into it have to pay more, or the people who are recipients of it have to get less. I'm not an economist, that's real basic. Those are the things that have to happen. We have to give somewhere. So these things on a local level, it's interesting because we have a large retiree population here in South Florida. It becomes problematic for us when their security is challenged. And I think that both gentlemen are right. We're going to solve it, but waiting longer doesn't make it better, and it doesn't make it easier. And that's the problem with virtually every big decision we have. Nothing that you can build this year will be cheaper if you build it next year. No problem that you can solve this year will be easier to solve next year. That's not the nature of the economy. That's not the nature of the problems that we face. And so they are complicated. They are becoming more complicated with time. These things become problematic at a local level. If you see, if for some reason reimbursements start to be limited and Jackson receive less money, well, Jackson's our safety net healthcare provider. That would be a problem for us. If for some reason this wonderful institution that we're sitting in, that's been a pathway up the ladder, the American dream, for so many people in this community, in this county, really in this country, because I think we're one of the largest colleges of our type in the entire country. If their financial or fiscal stability was challenged, that would become a problem. If you stop seeing investments in things like transportation, that becomes a problem, because when you build roads, when the federal government participates through the FTA and they give these grants, and we put billions of dollars in, those billions of dollars don't just put pavement and asphalt on the ground. What they do is put people to work. Those people buy things. Those people pay taxes. They pay into a system. And we rely on that money, because if we had to do those things without the federal government, it requires substantially more from the state government. It would require substantially higher tax rates from a local government. And so we have these conversations as though it's just their spending. If we stop getting those funds from the federal government, don't think that there's an effect just on the one end, just they're not spending it anymore. It's going to affect what they take in also. Mm-hmm. Because it's going to affect, the federal government's a very big direct and indirect employer. So it becomes a problem for people in this community and this county specifically when those things start to trigger and happen.
So, Ben, if it can be fixed and we can do it soon or wait to the very last minute, what are the measures that we can do now if Congress so wants to do it? Give us specifics so we understand what's tangible, what can truly be done.
So let me give you a couple things on the revenue side that I think, these are tough decisions. I mean, it's easy for me to sit here and say, oh, we should fix, but like when push comes to shove, we're talking about taking more money from people in terms of higher revenues and potentially cutting programs and spending, which were put in place for a reason. So it's not as easy as I think maybe I made it seem at the beginning. But on the revenue side, let me sort of bring up two areas that would be atop of my list. The first is around tax administration and closing what we call the tax gap. So there is this huge gap between what is owed and what is paid. And there has been, for the past, going from roughly, until Biden became president, for 10 years prior, just this very steep decline in funding for the IRS. And so that sort of got to the point with our tax code where it started to approximate a voluntary tax system, which looks a lot like countries like Greece that have had fiscal crises in the past. I was shocked at how political the issue has been that people who owe taxes should pay taxes. It's become very politicized. Republicans in Congress are staunchly opposed to it. They've characterized it as IRS agents with guns, which isn't really accurate, I say as a former Treasury official. But look, I am shocked that the honest taxpayers are not furious, and most people are honest taxpayers. There's one way to tell if you're in a group where you probably pay all the taxes that you owe versus another as a group you don't pay all the taxes you owe. If you get most of your income through wages, you're probably paying close to 100% of your taxes. If you're getting income from other sources, you are in a group that doesn't pay close to 100% of the taxes. But why are people not more furious that we are seeing increases in debt like this? Because we have a $500 billion a year gap between what's owed and what's paid. Why aren't the small business owners who are put at a competitive disadvantage by paying their taxes not angrier at what's going on? So the first thing I would start is by saying people should pay the taxes they owe, and we should give the IRS the resources to enforce the tax code. The second area, and we've been talking a lot about Social Security, when Social Security was started, Social Security is funded through taxes on wages, largely. When Social Security was started, if you added up all the wages, all the money, earnings that people had from jobs in the economy, about 90% of those were taxed that went into Social Security. Right now there's a cap of around $160,000, and if you make more than $160,000 in wages, you don't pay taxes on that amount above $160,000. So when Social Security was started, about 90% of the wages were taxed, but now it's gone down to about 82, 83%. So if we just went up to 90% and perhaps had some benefit adjustments, people started receiving their benefits later in Social Security, that would buy us, my guess is, depending on the specifics, decades in terms of Social Security solvency. It wouldn't put us on an infinite path towards being solvent. It wouldn't put us on a path for 75 years, but would fix a lot of the problems within that program from the get-go. So those are my two revenue choices. Having people pay the taxes they owe, but that requires the honest taxpayers to start demanding that out of politicians, and expanding the tax base on Social Security.
Doug, I see you shaking your head, nodding, but I also see the wheels turning. What's your response?
Well, I mean, on the Social Security reform, there have probably been 6 bipartisan commissions, private commissions, and all of the reforms look the same, and they all have the piece Ben just mentioned. Raise the taxable maximum on Social Security so you go back to 90% of covered wages. That's it. It makes a lot of sense. Surprisingly, maybe for this audience, people who do this a lot, the first thing they do on the benefit side is you make the minimum benefit richer. It's actually not what it should be in this day and age, and so you make the problem worse temporarily. Then you raise some revenue, and then you just more aggressively means test Social Security for Elon Musk and the like. I mean, you've got to you make those decisions, and Social Security lasts decades. Then it's not a hard arithmetic problem. It is a hard political problem, and that's really it. People should pay their taxes. There's no doubt about that. But I would also argue that there's a lot of the 2017 tax law that wasn't very well designed, and we could get the same revenue in a lot more efficient fashion, or raise more revenue without damaging the economy. And I think that's the most important thing in the next year.
Okay, I could ask questions all day, but I know a lot of you have some thoughts of your own, and you would probably like to ask some of these experts as well. So we have microphones at each side. If any of you have any questions for any of our panelists, please go to a microphone.
I'd like to tell him I'm actually mad.
Are you? Go.
I'm mad that people aren't paying their taxes, because I pay my taxes.
I hear you.
And so I would like them to pay. If you aren't paying your taxes in here, raise your hand.
Someone actually did.
Yeah, she raised her hand. Yeah. So pay your taxes, please.
Okay,
That's
who's
important.
up first? Go ahead.
How you doing? How you doing? Hi, my name is Dan Terrell Felton. I'm a student here studying economics. And my question would be, I see that there's a huge deficit, and we haven't had a surplus, like you said, since the mid-90s going into the 2000s. But I think corporate profit margins have taken precedence over national expansion. So what do you guys think we can do, or what we can invest in with some of this tax money that would increase production in the country and expansion nationally?
Go first.
It's a great question. So I think there's, taking huge generalizations, there's a couple different ways to answer that question. There's different views as far as the relationship between investment and economic growth. And one you've probably heard, it was, Reagan made it popular, but it was popular before that, is around sort of supply side economics. And it's an intellectually honest approach. I think there's nothing wrong with talking about supply side economics, but it basically says if we have low tax rates on investment, if we have kind of business-friendly environments for corporations and for investment that'll attract more economic activity in the United States, they'll ultimately end up growing the economy, that will boost wages because we'll have more investment in the United States. That's one approach, and that's sort of the theoretical foundations for much of the 2017 tax cut. There's a separate approach that was popularized by my former boss, Secretary Janet Yellen, which says, which she coined the term modern supply-side economics, which was to say it's not so much friendly conditions for businesses for investment, but rather investment in underserved communities, investment in education, investment in research and development. And I think you've seen the Biden administration adopt more of the latter approach. And you saw that through the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, where there was a lot of resources for manufacturing, for local communities, and subsidies for energy production. So there are different approaches, and a lot of times it's led by a president. We'll have different approaches. President Trump has adopted the supply side approach. President Biden adopted the modern supply side economics approach. I think it really just depends on the administration. I obviously served in the Biden administration. I'm a long-term Biden advisor, so I'm more sympathetic to the modern supply-side economics approach. I think it's safe to say Doug has been a longtime defender of supply-side economics, and so.
Full disclosure, I worked for George W. Bush 2001 to 2002 before I ran the Congressional Budget Office in 2003 to 2005. So I saw those. Ben's right. To grow, you have to save and invest. And there's no magic about private sector investment versus public sector investment. We need both. You need infrastructure, you need basic research, you need to do things that lay the foundation for future. And you also need private businesses inventing new business models, inventing new products and technologies, training their workers. The fundamental problem we have from an economic point of view is too little saving and investment compared to how much we're consuming. And the federal budget discussion is important because the federal budget is a huge mechanism for turning saving and investment into consumption. If you think about it, what is Social Security? We wanted old people to live better in their senior years. We wanted them to consume more. We wanted them to not pay health bills, so we gave them Medicare. Most of the programs in the federal budget are subsidies to consumption, which is fine because that's what the social safety net's about. It just has to be financially sustainable, and ours has gotten too big, and we need to get it right-sized so we can continue to do the investment, whether it's public sector investment or private sector investment.
Right. I think we have a question on this side. I'm sorry, go ahead, Chairman.
If you were looking at the chart that Cece put up in the very beginning, and it had the times when the debt just actually ballooned, and the times that were kind of lined up with some of the tax cuts.
Right.
And so what that tells me is that you called it supply side. I think they refer to it as trickle down economics. It just doesn't work. Not for the debt. It just doesn't work. That's just to say it plainly. The idea that if you cut taxes on the very wealthy, they'll invest more, has not been proven out by our economic experiences. Now, what I personally experienced is that when President Biden did the student loan forgiveness, I got my student loans forgiven. Some of my friends did too. I've been in public service for a long time. Well, one of my friends bought a car. The other one, two of us, we redid our houses. What we find is that when you actually give more money to people in the middle, they actually spend it. They actually spend it. And so I'm not an economist, but if you want to generate movement and upward motion in the economy, give money to people who spend it. You gave it by way of tax breaks to people who are very wealthy, And what the deficit shows is it didn't really work. And if we want to do something that works, we need to actually start having an honest conversation about what the numbers look like and what the numbers reflect. We can't do the same things again and expect different results in the economy. If we do the same things, we'll be back here in another couple of years having the exact same conversation, except it will be worse.
All right, I think there's a question over here on this side of the room.
Hello? Oh, all right, my name is Alex Gomez, student here at Miami Dade College. I used to be a finance major, but I switched over to philosophy. I did want to offer just a little bit of pushback on the comment of intellectual honesty with the supply side economics, but the gentleman in the middle addressed that perfectly. I also wanted to mention I don't know if you guys heard about the $11.2 billion in profit that Amazon had a couple of years ago and the $0 in taxes that they paid, but the other gentleman addressed that as well, along with his question. So I guess my question would be, I've been looking at a lot of charts as far as wage stagnation. Wages haven't moved in accordance with inflation. However, profits have moved way past inflation for the upper 20% businesses, which is great for our economy if supply-side economics worked. So my question would be, do you believe a change in wage, sort of looking at wages to change standard of living for people would move the economy in a positive fashion, or is there another foundational basis for that you guys believe would help us, as a people?
I'd like to take this first. I'm going to blame people, voters specifically. I think that you're right. Wages have become very stagnant, even as profits soared. But yet, people still elect state legislators and an entire legislature who says that you can't have a minimum living wage here in South Florida, even though the cost of living here in South Florida continues to go up. So he spoke a little earlier about it's not just politicians, it's not just academicians, it's not just people who work in public service or even economists. It's actual people. Democracy does actually work if you participate in it. If you participate in it. If you actually just vote your interests, if you know that your wages aren't keeping up and we need to be able to have a minimum living wage here in South Florida, then you vote for people who will allow you to have a minimum living wage, because what it costs to live in Miami-Dade County is not what it costs to live in Monticello, Florida. And having those same limitations across the entire state, even though the cost and standard of living in those different places is different, is ridiculous. But we don't participate in an honest level like that from a democratic perspective. We vote based on who had a coolest commercial, or in the alternative, we don't vote. We don't vote. And not voting, I'm not one of those people who says you just have to vote. Not voting is a choice also. But when you don't vote, understand that what you're saying is you're good with whatever we decide. The people who show up are going to elect people. They're going to make a decision. And if you didn't vote, you're saying you're good with it. So if you're good with it, then just be good with it. But it'd be great if you were good with it and quiet about it. Don't be good with it and then complain that we didn't fix the problem. We would love to fix the problem. Right now, the governor just signed a piece of legislation saying that we can't require that people who are working in the fields down south get heat protection. They're required to have water. We can't require that you give them water. But that's because the legislature's allowed to pass it and he's allowed to sign it. And I respect his authority and his opinion. He's been very consistent, so have they. They won the election. When you win elections, they have consequences. These are the consequences. If you don't like the consequences, change the next election.
And the big one's coming up in about 6 months, believe it or not. It's going to be that quickly. Okay, we have one more question over here.
So can I talk about
Yeah,
the
go
real
ahead.
wages? Okay, so great question about real wages. One of the wonderful things about this recovery has been at the very bottom, that's where we're seeing the biggest wage gains. So the bottom 20 or 40% of workers are the areas where you're seeing the wages are rising faster than inflation. So we are actually seeing a compression of inequality for the first time in a really long time. It's a wonderful story for this current recovery. In terms of pushing up wages, I think it's one of the top economic priorities for policymakers, or it should be. There are three ways I think that you can boost wages. The first is to have a tight labor market, which is really the responsibility of the Federal Reserve. And we've had historically low unemployment, not just for the economy as a whole, but traditionally for workers who have a hard time finding jobs. So historically low levels of unemployment for black workers, historically low levels of unemployment for workers with disabilities. It's been a really good news story, not just on the macro side, but for particular groups of workers. The second way you can boost wages is by making workers more productive. And everyone who's involved in this institution deserves credit for being part of that push. So attending school here will make you a more productive worker and will boost your wages in the future. There are other ways to become more productive, on-the-job training, other things, but productivity is really important. That's the second way. The third way, I think, is by making the labor market more competitive. And economists for a long time thought that your wage was exclusively determined by how productive you were. But recently, there's this very well-known economist who gave an address at the American Economic Association titled, "Who Sets Your Wage?" His name's David Card, and his whole point was, well, maybe we should test this assumption that your wage, if you're getting paid $17 an hour, that's because you're worth $17 an hour. And if you're getting paid $41 an hour, it's because you're worth $41 an hour. Policies which kind of break up that relationship. So for example, non-compete agreements. Non-compete agreements, if you are prohibited from taking yourself as a worker at a job and going to another job, maybe that means that if you're worth $30 an hour, well, you can only get paid $24 because you're legally prohibited from going and taking that higher job. If you don't know your wages as they are distributed across the economy, let's say you're let's say you're a dog groomer, and you don't know what other dog groomers are paid, but the company that owns the dog groomers knows what everyone is paid, you're at a disadvantage. That's wage transparency. So there's all these other examples, mandatory arbitration, lots of things like that create this disconnect between what you're worth as a worker and what you're actually getting paid. So I think those are three strategies for boosting wages. But let's be clear, this current recovery has had very much a good news story. You've seen a compression of inequality, and the people whose wages have been rising the fastest have been those who need it the most, and they're at the bottom.
Mm-hmm. Doug, do you have anything to add?
No, that's right. I guess the thing I would emphasize is that looking forward, I think the great challenge facing America is the poor performance of its K-12 education system, where for a decade, we've seen a quarter to a third of 4th and 8th graders seriously deficient in math and reading. They're never going to catch up. They're never going to be as skilled as they should be. They're never going to get the wages that we would hope. And that, to me, needs to be addressed. That should be a top priority.
Go ahead.
Good morning, and thank you for being here. I have a couple of questions. The first one is probably for Ben regarding the deficit and the income. Which is going to be more effective, raise taxes or make the people that don't pay taxes paying taxes in that part of the budget? And then the second question is, this deficit situation has been going for years and years and years, and it's going to be going for year. In my personal opinion, I think the only thing that can happen that is going to bring people to ground and say, okay, we need to attack this problem is a crisis. So the question for you guys is, what needs to happen in order for our politicians to take care of that budget deficit?
So I'll be quick because I also want to give Doug a chance to weigh in here. But practically speaking, it's going to take a combination of tax increases and spending cuts if we want anything to get through Congress in a sort of sustainable way, most likely. So where do I think that there's opportunities for spending cuts? Well, on the health side of things. And actually, one area where I think Republicans and Democrats tend to agree is around things like prescription drugs, and that we can make those much cheaper. They're much more expensive in the United States relative to other countries. That's one area we can look. I'm much more familiar with President Biden's budget than I am with President Trump's. They both had cuts in health spending. President Biden wanted to do it by making the U.S. government a more effective negotiator with drug companies. So that was the first question. The second question around what would it take is I think we're going to have to see a sharp increase in interest rates. We're going to have to see the people who buy these bonds kind of freak out. And that's already happened a little bit. So last summer, I'll try to make this quick, but Treasury periodically releases estimates of how much it's going to need to borrow. And last summer, Treasury surprised financial markets by saying we're going to have to borrow about an extra $250 billion than we thought prior. And markets just freaked out. And so on a 10-year Treasury bond, markets were charging about 4% on that Treasury bond, and they pretty quickly went to a 5%, which is a big increase in markets just because of that little freak out. I think it's going to take something of that nature, but a bigger magnitude, for politicians to say, okay, this is a really serious problem. I don't know how big it's going to have to be, but if $250 billion, which is really small in the context of $27 trillion in debt outstanding, can cause a freak out for a 1% increase in interest rates, well, then maybe we need something along the lines of 2 or 3% increase in interest rates for politicians to say, look, this is a huge problem. It threatens the long-term vibrancy of the US economy. We're going to have to address it. But I think it's going to take that type of freak out to get the type of solutions we've been searching for at least 25 years. Sorry, Doug.
So magnitudes, we're going to average deficits of $2 trillion a year for the next 10 years. Ben's tax gap is about $500 billion. If you got all of it, you'd still have a $1.5 trillion deficit, so the work is not done. You're going to have to do something on the spending side. You're going to have to do something on the tax side to narrow that gap. And that's just the raw arithmetic of where we are. There's no freebies. It's all hard work. Now, I think you just have to pick your crisis to solve this. His preferred crisis is a financial market meltdown. Not mine. There's some others. One is the rating analysts who people rely on to sort of buy different bonds. They can freak out in advance of the market knowing it's coming. We've seen that already. There's a rating agency, Fitch, downgraded the U.S. And downgraded the U.S. not because our economy's broken, not because our people are lazy, not because of any of those things, but because the politics, we're not effectively managing our finances. We need to actually be able to make decisions and manage our finances. So that could be the early warning signal. There's also some political fallout here. Go back to the Social Security example. If every year I'm trying to plan my retirement and I don't know what I'm going to get, I'm going to start nagging my congressman and saying, hey, you need to fix this. And if we can switch the conversation in the town hall from, if you touch my Social Security, I won't vote for you, to, if you don't touch Social Security, I won't vote for you, then the democracy on the ground is going to work. And that's what we need to have happen. And so there's some pressure there. And the last one, I think, is very real. If you go back to what Cecilia Rouse said about the federal budget, we used to be all annual decisions of Congress, discretionary spending, and now it's flipped, and that's a minority of the spending. That's two things. Number one, that's where you do basic research, infrastructure, education, all the sort of investments in the future, and they're getting crowded out by these other programs. And that's where you get the chance to do something new. I have a daughter and a son-in-law and 2 grandchildren, and they think the United States should have a paid family leave program. There have been lots and lots of proposals for paid family leave. There's never been any money. It's all spoken for by programs we set up in the 60s. And so there's a political crisis when the new generations of voters can't get the government to do what they want. I mean, they pay taxes and they vote. Why can't my programs get enacted? And the answer is the other programs are too big.
All right. Gentlemen, thank you so much. This has been so enlightening. We could sit here and talk for days. I know you have lots of questions. In fact, we have one other man standing right there. Could you tell us your question?
Hi. Can you hear? Okay. Hi, my name is Zalman Brooker, and I'm new to economics, and I came here to learn about that. And my question is regarding social and public resources. And as I understand it, a large percentage of taxes go to fundings for public resources and social resources like the Medicare and Social Security. And if we cut taxes, I understand there is a problem with how we're going to fund these public and social resources. My question is, how can we, at the same time, make taxation more viable for the general public, the middle class, as well as maintaining these public and social resources?
So I would just say that Oliver said this the best a little while back when he said, the first thing you decide is what do you want to spend the money on? Once you make that decision, you've committed to financing it somehow. Our typical approach to financing has been to borrow a lot of the money. And we need to instead make those decisions and agree to pay the taxes necessary to support them. I don't think there's any impediment to having a tax system that everyone can pay their fair share of taxes and cover these programs. We've just politically put it in a position where 98% of the taxpayers are off limits. Anyone under 400,000 is not going to pay more taxes. With Mr. Trump, no one's going to pay more taxes. That's not going to add up, right? That's the issue.
Do we have time for one more question? Okay, great. Over here on this side of the room. Hi.
Hi, my name is Diallo Williams. I'm from the Career Advisement Department, and I'm an advisor here. And my question was, is there, or it seems like there's room for opportunity in our military budget, which is massive. Just this weekend, we spent over $1.3 billion in the Middle East. Now, obviously, it was necessary, but are we considering maybe rethinking some of our policies that cause us to have this massive military budget that I know is a huge part of our national budget? Maybe cutting back on that would give us some of the liquidity that we need to fund some of these other programs.
So, no. No, we're not. It's difficult because we don't connect them. But our military spending and foreign aid and the things that we do that we don't necessarily see it here, it provides a safety for us to exist here and for our economy to grow here. And for us, it provides that type of security. So we're always going to have, from my perspective, we always should have the most capable military in the world, the most dangerous military in the world. Are beautiful. Our Constitution is immaculate. How we've evolved our democracy is extraordinary. But it's protected by men and women who are armed and a military that people are afraid of. And so I know that sometimes people will say we need to cut military spending. In an ideal world, we wouldn't need a military. But in the real world, we do. And so it's the same when people talk about police officers and how much we invest in law enforcement at a local level. You know, we have a thriving economy here in Miami-Dade County, but it's part of that is a lot of the social ills that have beset larger urbanized areas, we've controlled them some. Crime relatively low for an large urbanized area. Homelessness relatively low for a large urbanized area. And you see people coming here from other large urbanized areas. A lot of that is because of our investment in law enforcement. And so we don't do a good enough job, I believe, connecting the dots about how these things are really inextricably intertwined. We don't get to be who we are as a country without that military being who it is. And so that's the absolute truth. So I don't think that we will cut, but I do think we can find efficiencies wherever. But the truth is that we're going to have to find, as a part of that national conversation, where we want to create balance, understanding what it is we want to accomplish as a country.
So one budget geek addendum. The Pentagon budget has the same problems as the larger federal budget on a smaller scale. It's got a pension problem. We owe military pensions. They are not fully funded. That's a problem. It's got a healthcare problem. TRICARE is a very expensive program. And so when you see the Pentagon budgets, you sort of automatically assume, oh, that's weapons, artillery, and soldiers. A huge chunk of it is these benefits issues that are a legacy of the past.
Two quick thoughts. So I'm not qualified to say whether or not the military budget is the optimal one or not. But I will say, until 2016, I thought I understood American politics. It became clear I did not understand American politics. And I thought that we all agreed, there's not a lot we agree on. I thought we all agreed to take care of our veterans. That just says something I just felt like if someone's willing to sacrifice their lives to die for this country, we take care of them. We take care of their health care, we take care of their pension. That feels like it's cracking, and that worries me. The second thing I'll say is when Cece put up a chart and she saw the change over the past, that showed the change over the past 40 years towards a federal government that used to spend a lot on discretionary spending and a little bit on mandatory, and now you saw it switched. Well, discretionary spending, the way that I describe it, it's not a perfect explanation, but it's like that's the public goods spending. That's a spending that benefits society rather than individuals. And mandatory spending is the exact opposite. And we've seen and military spending is a form of public good spending. It benefits everyone. We're all protected. So is infrastructure spending. So is spending on justice. And so is spending on transportation. And so broadly speaking, without being able to comment on the precise amount we spent on the military, I am troubled by this switch, that we're spending so much less on public goods. And we've seen this slow death in public goods. Public goods are often the type of spending that determine our standard of living in the future. Things like whether or not you're secure, things like whether or not we're spending on research, things like whether or not we're spending on education. And I am troubled by the slow death of the public good in the U.S. budget.
Okay, we have another question over here.
Thank you. I'm Shankia Brooks. Hi, thank you. Thank you. My name is Shankia Brooks. I'm into medical science. I'm a student here. According to the Treasury, the official Treasury of the United States government, since its founding, the United States has been in debt. My question, is there a plan to get rid of debt and stay out of debt altogether, or will it be an ongoing cycle? Thank you.
Mr. Treasury official.
So debt in and of itself is not a bad thing. Most countries carry debt. And you've heard us say a couple times over the course of this session that in the late 90s and early 2000s, we actually were running surpluses. And in 2000, I was at an event at the Brookings Institution where we were wondering, oh no, what happens if there's no treasury debt? Because it's part of the global financial system. So it's not the existence of debt which is a problem. It's the size of the debt. And if you told me we're going to be at 30% of GDP for debt for the next 30 years, I really wouldn't have much of a concern. So the question is, how big is too big? And there was some prominent research which showed you start to worry about debt when it gets to be about 90% of GDP. Now, we have blown through that. We're around 100% of GDP for debt and projected to go much higher over the next decade. So the question around debt, it's kind of a fundamental question, like how big is too big? We're doing okay with 100% of GDP, but 110 may be too big, 120 may be too big. And we're going to find out, I think, unfortunately, how big is too big. But we just don't know. But it's not debt in and of itself which is a problem. It's the magnitude of the debt and the fact that we're just running deficits every year, regardless of how the economy is doing. So even though we're in the current economic expansion, we're still running these deficits, which just pretends this sort of long-term, ongoing problem.
Okay, we have some online questions for folks who are watching right now. One of them is, can anything meaningful get done about the budget without impacting Social Security and or Medicare?
Oh, I have a great answer for that. So I'm going to give you some numbers. Don't remember them and certainly don't repeat them with your friends because you won't have any. That's my experience. Over the next 10 years, we're going to spend $82 trillion out of the federal government. That's my old shop's projection. $12 trillion of that's going to be interest on previous borrowing, and so that's a big chunk of what we do now. It's just simply pay interest on previous borrowing. It's not available for anything else. 20 is going to be these discretionary programs Ben was just describing, places where we provide public goods. The remaining 50, the vast majority, are going to be so-called mandatory spending or entitlements. And of those, Social Security and Medicare are $32 trillion. So you can't meaningfully impact the federal budget without talking about Social Security and Medicare. They are large, 32 out of 82, and they are growing faster than all the other parts, except for interest right now. So, at some point, you do the arithmetic. You got to go make these programs sustainable over the long term, and they're not. Medicare, because of its design, is responsible for 1/3 of all federal debt outstanding. It has an open-ended draw in the Treasury, and it uses it. So I think we need to have a safety net that we can sustain over a long period of time, and that's where you have to go.
Does that mean cuts, though? Is that safety net
Grow
cuts?
slower, don't cut it down. You want those programs, Social Security 5.5%, Medicare 7%, to grow at the pace of the economy over the long term.
Okay.
That's not going to mean draconian cuts. No one who's currently on Social Security should see it decline. Future beneficiaries will get more than we get right now. It's just the growth is slower.
Got it. Anything you want to add?
The only thing I'll say, one of the real challenges of Social Security is that, and this is a feature over the past 8 or 9 years, it used to be that people with college degrees and without college degrees would see their life expectancy grow at kind of parallel rates. And over the past 10 years, that's changed. And so people with college degrees who tend to be more affluent are living much longer, and their life expectancy is increasing much longer than those without. And so there are solutions to it, and Doug mentioned, kind of alluded to the presence of solutions earlier, but that's a real challenge, is that if you're going to cut or slow the growth in Social Security, and you're going to say, look, maybe you need to wait a little bit longer to get your benefits, that's not an equal reform. That's disproportionately hurting people who are expected to die sooner. And so there's a real equity challenge with Social Security. I don't have a great answer. There are creative ways, and Doug said you can maybe go with better means testing. That's potentially one option. But that's one reason why Social Security reform is so tricky. Anyway.
Why isn't it being tackled now, though? If it's such a big deal and we're all going to be hit with it, why are we waiting?
So in 2004, we took a run at Social Security reform, and I was the CDO director at the time. We spent a lot of time working with Congress on this. And former Ways and Means Chairman Bill Thomas explained this phenomenon to me very clearly. He said, look, Social Security is a simple program. You pay payroll taxes, you hand out benefits. The formula for payroll taxes is simple. The formula for benefits is simple. Everyone can see exactly what you're doing. So we know exactly who's going to lose, and we know exactly who's going to win. And the first group is in my office right now. And it never got done. And so it's the politics. It's not the substance of the program, it's the politics.
One really, really wonky thing to note about Social Security. So most big changes that have been legislated through something called reconciliation. And without going into all the details, reconciliation allows you to pass laws through the Senate with 50 votes. And when we're in an era where the Senate tends to have 51 votes with one party and 49 with another, if you want to pass a big bill, it pretty much needs to be done through reconciliation. You maybe remember in 2017 when Senator McCain gave that big thumbs down no to ACA repeal. That was done through reconciliation. The reason it was done through reconciliation is because Republicans only had, I think, 51 or 52 votes in the Senate. The Affordable Care Act under President Obama, that was done through reconciliation. The 2017 tax cuts, that was done through reconciliation. The American Rescue Plan, that was done through reconciliation. What cannot be reformed through reconciliation? Social Security. Right. So that means, and that's just written into the law, it says you can use anything for reconciliation as long as it's germane to the budget. So you couldn't do something like, with reproductive rights because that wasn't necessarily germane to the budget. But anything else that's germane to the budget can be done through reconciliation except for Social Security. That means it's going to take bipartisan compromise. That means you're going to need 60 votes in the Senate. And right now, it's hard for me to imagine something which gets through the Senate with 60 votes, which can garner 10 votes from one party while getting 50 votes from the other.
Yes, so your last question was, if it's so important, why aren't we doing it now? We govern in political cycles, and we don't govern for generational choices or long-term decisions. And so these are long-term problems that can all be pushed out past the 2-year House of Representatives cycle, the 4-year presidency, the 6-year Senate seat. We govern in cycles. And so if you constantly think about what the next election looks like, it makes it very difficult to focus on what the next generation looks like. And so I think that we probably need to do more looking at what the next generation looks like. One of the things that I like to talk about from a local level is our job is to exist right now, but fundamentally the primary job is to plan for the continuity of this community. So how do I continue to grow the economy, the wellness of Miami-Dade County? I'm trying to build something that's sustainable for my son and my son's son. And if we think about it from a longer term perspective and not just how we get elected, you'd be surprised if you have a thoughtful conversation, you can run a campaign to explain your decisions, just make reasonable decisions. From the politics of this is difficult because people have to get elected. I was never a proponent for term limits, but I bet you if we had term limits in the House and the Senate and people didn't have to worry about staying there for 40 years, they'd actually get something done.
Plus, the answer is not exactly an easy one. It's not one that's really going to have someone going, hey, elect me on cutting Social Security, right? I mean, that's a hard sell.
So it requires great leadership, and I think the vast number of Americans are blissfully unaware of how big the problem is. I think they really don't know federal budget problem as a whole, Social Security's problems as a whole, and so elections are teachable moments, right? People run for higher office, president in particular, and they say these are the things that are important, and this is how I would like to address them. We haven't had that conversation in the 21st century about the debt or Social Security or anything. It just didn't happen. So we need that, and something really important happens when that conversation occurs. The president then asks Congress to do something, and your average House member can go back to the town hall and say, I didn't want to do this, but the president asked us to, and he wants to do it this way, and by the way, that's a terrible plan, we'll fix it. And they get credit for fixing it. And then presidents can provide a lot of air cover. President Biden did this on the infrastructure bill. It failed twice in the Senate. Twice he called him over to the White House and said, I want this. And he said to the Republicans, what's it going to take for you to vote? And they said, can't touch the 2017 tax law. Fine, it's off limits. When the Democrats said, what's the problem here? They're after our spending programs. Fine, those are off limits. And they got the yes, and he got the votes in the House, and he signed it. That kind of leadership, education to the public, leadership out of the White House, that's the only way for this to get done.
Let me ask you a question. So during the 2020 election, I was the economic advisor for the Biden campaign, and one of my jobs was helping to coordinate, put together a Social Security reform plan. And then candidate Biden did release a Social Security reform plan. Is anyone in this room aware of that Social Security reform plan that he put out? Nope. One person? So it was scored by the Urban Institute, another think tank in DC. They found it would add about 20 years to solvency for Social Security. Look, if you want to spend 15 minutes, I can go through all the basic points, but my fundamental point is no one in this room was aware of it. I'm not saying that's your fault. I'm saying the media didn't think it was worth covering. I don't think candidate Biden talked a lot about it. Candidate Trump did not release his own plan. I don't know if each candidate will have one this time around. So, I don't think it's really in politicians' best interest to attack this issue.
It's her fault.
It's her
It's
fault.
my
It's
fault.
her fault.
I'm sorry. Big bad media here. Sorry about that, folks. I failed you. All right. Well, I'm going to try to make it up because we have a gentleman over here who's been waiting very patiently. What's your question, sir?
Okay, first of all, my name is Philip Dickey. I work here at Miami Dade College, so I do want to say that anything I express is my opinion and not the opinion of the college. All right, so a couple observations. I lived, I'm 58, so since we're telling ages, and I lived during Reaganomics. I've lived during, the Clinton years, et cetera, So, and I've seen kind of both sides of the spectrum. I've seen the tax and spend, et cetera. And one thing I know is supply side was always detrimental in a lot of ways because it was a trickle down effect, and it really was a trickle, small trickle. On the other side, though, giving a lot of money out to people, a lot of times, to the population, a lot of times increases demand, increases inflation. I think we saw a lot of that when you put $4 trillion plus out in the pandemic. A lot of our inflation we're having right now, you throw all those dollars out, they got to go somewhere, and so that created a lot of our issues. I'm a veteran, so I do have to say, though, if everybody on the panel is honest in terms of what is our biggest contributor to our national debt, right? I believe it would be defense, the defense budget. Not saying we don't need a strong defense. As I said, I'm a veteran. But we're spending a lot of talk about Social Security and making it the boogeyman. instead of sometimes looking at defense and saying, what can we do there to be smarter about the way we're spending those dollars? An old story is that, somebody lost money and they were looking for it, and somebody said, okay, can I help you look? And they said, yeah. They said, where'd you lose it? And they said, the other side of the room. And they said, well, why are you looking over here? They said, the light's better. And sometimes I think that's what we're doing with making Social Security, et cetera, the boogeyman, is we don't want to talk about defense. We don't want to talk about how maybe we can fix that and still have a strong defense, protect, our nation. Instead, we're focusing on something that really isn't contributing to the problem. It's not, okay? Then we have to talk about, when we have defense and it's making up the biggest portion of our national debt, who owns that debt? And if we're talking about foreign government, foreign banks, how much of a national security risk is that? And that would be the question.
So, I think, I guess I would disagree that the defense budget is a primary driver. It is a large portion, but it's been falling over time as a share of GDP, and as we've seen from President Rouse's slides, you're seeing growth in other areas. Sorry, your second question was really interesting, and I just forgot it, which was, with foreign ownership. Okay, so there is a worry about foreign banks and foreign investors' ownership of U.S. Treasury securities and saying, is that a national security risk? So the share, largely because of what's going on in China, but not exclusively, the share of treasuries owned by foreigners went from about 30% down to around 21, 22% over the past 10 years. So if that was something you were worried about 10 years ago, you should feel a little bit better today. Secondly, most of this is owned by the private sector. It's not owned by a foreign central bank, which can be a bit more coordinated in response. In 2004, I went to go work for the House Budget Committee, and this was like fever pitch for concerns around foreign ownership of Treasury securities. And the kind of thinking was, well, we've surrendered all the security basically to China, and couldn't the Chinese central bank go ahead and sell off $300 billion of Treasury securities and cause a financial crisis? The answer is yes, the Chinese could probably sell off that amount and create at least a big shock for a short period of time until others came in and bought it. But I think we realized that wouldn't be in the best interest of China. And they haven't had this sort of big coordinated shock. So I think it's a good question to ask. It's a good question to say, have we surrendered some of our economic security to foreign investors? But in general, foreign investment in the United States is a good thing, not a bad thing. The fact that foreigners have been willing to buy our debt is a good thing, not a bad thing. It would be much, much worse if we had to rely on ourselves to finance it. So I think it's a good question to ask, but it doesn't raise my blood pressure right now.
How you doing blood pressure-wise, Doug?
So now I know who to blame. So this is when I was the CBO director, and the chairman called me up and said, my guys are agitated about China and China having the debt, and I want you to come up and testify and tell us those good economist things and take a beating. And so they did. I sat there at the table and they screamed at me for...
You're welcome.
Thank you.
We have another online question. It says, at what percentage of GDP does an economy's debt load typically become unsustainable?
So this is a great question. And the correct answer is I have no idea. Because the debt load becomes unsustainable when global investors lose confidence that you'll be able to repay in a timely fashion the principal and the interest. And so it has nothing to do with a number. It has to do with the confidence of investors in your ability to manage your numbers. As Ben noted earlier, we've seen the debt to GDP go from 30% in the early 2000s up to 100%, and that loss in confidence hasn't happened yet. So I don't know what the number is that's going to be the one that drives global capital markets over the edge, but I don't actually want to know. I see no reason to run the experiment. Let's just have a better fiscal policy and put this on a sustainable track.
Yeah.
This is a great time to bring up a really important difference between a government shutdown and breaching the debt ceiling. Now, it is unfortunate that you all should know this. Like this should be something that people inside the Treasury think a lot about and normal Americans don't, but unfortunately you've got to know it. So a government shutdown is what happens when that discretionary spending that makes up roughly 40% of our budget that Congress has to appropriate each year And unfortunately, it doesn't really, in recent memory, Congress tends not to do the appropriations the way it's supposed to. It often says, yeah, let's just do what we did last year, and we'll take our time deciding what the amount should be. But if Congress does not appropriate that 40%, those agencies have to start shutting down. It is a sign that we have a dysfunctional government, but really is not a crisis. You saw a shutdown during the Trump administration, hasn't happened on President Biden's watch. It really was not a crisis, even though we had a government shutdown for about 30 days. I mean, it was unfortunate for parks. It ends up costing our budget around $10 or $20 billion as we have to repay things, and it's kind of inefficient. But government shutdowns are a symptom of a dysfunctional government, but they're not generally a crisis. What is a crisis is if we breach the debt ceiling. And if we breach the debt ceiling, we're basically saying to the Treasury Department, or maybe to the White House, you have to decide what bills you're going to pay. And twice during my time at Treasury, we came up against a debt ceiling crisis, and we had to spend so many staff hours meeting twice a day to go through all of these legal discussions, what can we legally pay and not pay, economically, what should we pay and not pay, having presentations about all of the different payment systems for the Treasury Department. I mean, it was incredibly complex, but this would be a catastrophe. And this would be a catastrophe because what could happen is we either have to basically pay interest on Treasury loans, or we don't pay Social Security beneficiaries, or we don't pay government contractors, which means that workers don't get paid. It's a series of terrible choices. But what would probably happen overnight is that all these investors who have bought $27 trillion in bonds have lost faith that they'll get paid. And I don't know what is the right level of debt to GDP, which is catastrophic, but I will tell you that breaching the debt ceiling would be catastrophic, whether you're at 40% or whether you're at 100% of GDP, because that's when investors say, all right, maybe you are not going to pay me on my bond and I need to get paid.
And Mr. Doom and Gloom will just chime in and remind everyone that the deal they cut was to suspend the debt ceiling until January 2025. So the very first thing a new Congress and President are going to have to do is deal with the debt ceiling, because when it comes back, we will already be over it. And so having a plan would be a good idea.
Yes, plans are always a good idea, right?
Same.
Thank you, Jill. This has been just such a wonderful discussion, very enlightening. I want to invite now up the presidential advisor, Amy Lou, for some final remarks.
First of all, can we just give an incredible round of applause to Betty and the experts on our panels today? That was a superb discussion. I want to start by saying that I'm in my 50s, and that's about the level of detail you're going to get. I've had the pleasure of overseeing our Issues at Stake initiative, and I just want to wrap up this morning's program by sharing 2 statistics with you, courtesy of a recent Pew Research Center poll on the state of U.S. politics. The first statistic, 78% of Americans, 78%, believe there's too little attention paid on the important issues facing the country. 78%. 86% of Americans believe in this statement, that Republicans and Democrats are more focused on fighting each other than solving problems. So in other words, the vast majority of Americans, they actually just want more policy over politics and more problem solving than partisan posturing. And that is why we're here today, and that's why Brookings launched this initiative, and why we reached out to Miami Dade College to organize this forum. Because we wanted to make sure that the general public, that the voters, people like you here in the room, those on the webcast virtually, that you all had an opportunity to actually learn about at least one of the critical issues facing our country, in this case, the size and nature of the federal debt, so that you all, that we can make informed decisions about the kind of leaders we want, that you want. And as Chairman Oliver said earlier today, it's really important now, and always has been, to have a participatory democracy. And to do that, you have to understand that many of the issues that we face are really complicated ones and require a lot of thoughtful analysis and discussions that don't get captured very simply in sound bites. The other thing we wanted to do today and through this initiative is to show that differences of opinions and differences of perspectives do not mean that bipartisan solutions are not possible. And in fact, as you heard in the discussion today, there are actually quite a few areas of agreement, that there are some ways forward. Yes, we need some political will, but there are ways that we can work together to get things done. So I want to thank President Pumariega and her team for their stellar collaboration on this effort. Please, I do want to thank again our moderator and our panelists for their expertise, their civility, their thoughtfulness, their real-world perspectives, and translating it down to people in our communities. I think it does show again why we do need thoughtful leadership and political will in our country. It's good for the economy and it's good for our future generations. If you are part of that 78% who want to learn more about the issues, which I think you are because you're here and you've joined us on the virtual webcast, please check out our Brookings website. We do have a page dedicated to Election 24 issues at stake. And in fact, if you go back to the check-in desk, there's a QR code that makes it easier for you to access our website. What you'll find there is you'll find more information about the debt and the spending. You'll also find important information and access to future forums on other issues that we will be covering that are confronting the nation. Things like jobs, the economy, immigration, climate and energy, responsible AI, and America's role in the world. So again, I want to thank you all for joining us this morning, and for those on the webcast, please have a great day.
You did a great job. Thank you.
You did a phenomenal job. I think they